Hey, I'm going to go in and redo the watercolor techniques. I had some issues with it uploading due to how large, or I should say how long, the video was. So I'm going to go in, I'll try to kind of condense it, and if I need to do two different videos, I sure will. So I'm going to go in and walk you through what you need for your watercolor project. You are going to want your paper towel, you're going to want your water, paintbrush, and I'm just using a round brush, and then you are going to want a palette. You can either use the cover of your watercolors, or you can just use what I did here, an ice cream lid or a plastic lid. What we're going to do is we're going to use our 6x6 watercolor paper, and we're going to go in and we're going to complete for sure 8 techniques. If you want to do the 9th one, you sure can. So here's my paper. I'm going to start with my paper, and we are going to do the first technique, which is wet into wet. Now with wet into wet, there's technically 2 different ways you can do it. You can do a wet color into another wet color, or for my example, I'm just going to show you wet into wet with plain water. So I'm going to go in and I'm going to paint about a 2x2 square on my paper. So I'm basically just doing a square of water on my paper. There's that. Now, when you get your paints ready, we should work on not taking our paint directly from the watercolor cake itself. We should work on taking it to the palette so we're more familiar with how much water or how much paint we actually have on our brush. So you can see what I'm doing here is I'm just mixing up some of that blue-violet paint over on my palette. So I know roughly how much pigment I have in there and how much water I do. When it's in here, more than likely it's going to be highly concentrated. So I've got my wet square, and I'm going to take my wet watercolor paint and I'm going to paint it onto my square. And you can see what happens is it just spreads easily and it fills that space a lot quicker. If you take more paint and less water, you will get a darker color. And if you take more water, less paint, your color will be a lot lighter. And for this particular technique, you can also intermix like colors. So if I wanted to go in with some green and drop some green into it, I could do that. I could leave it, or I could even mix it right there on the paper. And then it kind of creates that forest green or that army green color. If you ever get a spot where it's pooling, we call that pooling, where it's collecting, you can take a little bit of your paper towel and you can lift gently and get some of that extra paint off. All right, and again, you could also keep working on this and you could keep practicing with it. But again, it's pretty simple, wet into wet. The next one is a dry brush technique. So you want to make sure that you have an active amount of paint on your palette. So I have paint that's ready to go. But then I'm going to dry my brush because it is called dry brush. You dry your brush, and then you are going to, I always like to dry it out on my hand too. You're going to dip into your paint, and then I'm going to go in and I'm going to make my square. And then what's going to happen is your paint is going to run out on your brush, and it's going to leave that sketchiness of on your paper. You can see it leaves a little bit of that underlying bit of paper. This is something you could do for like a reflection in a water, or if you just want something that isn't quite complete. You can see it. It creates that really neat texture on there. All right, the next one that I have for you is one where you're going to utilize a paper towel, and you're just going to do something called a wet brush technique, where you take your paint and you are going to create a box of color or a block of color. And again, I'm just wet brush. I'm making my value quite dark. And then you can wait a little bit longer if you want the pigment to soak in a little bit more. Otherwise, you can go in and you can lift off that pigment, and this creates, it can create texture depending on what you use to lift. Or if you really wanted to, you could create a pastel color by lifting off almost all of it. And again, this is a nice technique for blocking in solid colors, or if you're trying to get a little bit of a lighter color within. And you can just, you know, again, you can do more layers over this. That's the great thing about watercolor. I can do a little bit more paint here, let it sit, and then I could lift a little bit of it. And then right there, I've created another shape within the same color of paint. The next one is called tape resist. So you're gonna wanna use a little bit of tape. Now you can use masking tape, Scotch tape, painter's tape. If you don't have tape, you could even use a sticker. But you can see I'm just gonna put down a few pieces of tape, push them down really well. And what's gonna happen is wherever there's tape, it is going to resist the paint. So I'll go in, I'm gonna take a little bit of green, mix it with a tiny bit of my blue, and I'm gonna go in and paint using wet brush. I'm using the wet brush technique again. I'm gonna paint right over the top of my tape. That. And what will happen is over time it'll dry. I will peel away the tape and it will reveal a negative shape or space. And you can see that in this one here, my example, where the white of the paper is left. You would do that on an area in your artwork where you want a highlight, or you want to make sure that no paint touches that area and the paper stays nice, crisp, and clean. So wet into wet, dry brush. Make sure you actually dry your brush and kind of wipe it out so you're getting that nice scuffy look. This is lifting off or lift off, where you paint and then you take a paper towel or a tissue and you lift some of that paint off. This is tape resist, or again, you can use a sticker or anything that's going to stay down.